On the morning of Emily and James's wedding day, everything seemed perfect. The sun was shining brightly through the windows, casting a warm glow on the elegant decorations that filled the venue. Guests filled the church, talking excitedly as they admired the beautiful floral arrangements and the grand aisle. It was the day everyone had been waiting for. The big day, the start of a new chapter for the couple. Emily had always dreamed of this moment. She was dressed in a stunning white gown, the kind she had imagined since she was a little girl. The dress fit her like a glove, the intricate lacework and delicate beads catching the light as she moved. Her hair was styled flawlessly, her makeup done to perfection, and she looked every bit like the beautiful bride she had always imagined herself to be. Her family, especially her mother, was beyond thrilled, with happy tears in their eyes as they looked at their daughter ready to marry the man of her dreams. James, on the other hand, was standing nervously at the altar. He had always been a bit more reserved, especially in moments of deep emotion. But today, as he adjusted his tie and looked around at the gathering crowd, he couldn't help but smile. He was marrying Emily, the woman he loved with all his heart. He thought of how they had met years ago, and how far they had come together. James was black, and Emily was white, which had caused some people to raise their eyebrows in the past, but they had never let anyone's opinions affect their love for each other. The ceremony began, and everyone stood as the music played softly in the background. The bridesmaids walked down the aisle first, wearing dresses of soft pastel colors, followed by the flower girl, who tossed petals in the air. The crowd smiled, watching as the procession continued. All eyes were on Emily as she made her way down the aisle, her eyes locked on James, who was waiting for her with a nervous smile. As Emily reached the altar, she noticed the warmth in James's eyes, and for a moment, everything else seemed to fade away. It was as if they were the only two people in the world, and the ceremony was theirs to cherish. They exchanged a quiet smile, both feeling the weight of the moment. The minister began the ceremony with the usual words, asking if they took each other as husband and wife. Emily's heart raced in anticipation as she glanced at James, waiting for the moment they would become husband and wife. The guests smiled and whispered among themselves, proud of the couple and excited for the life ahead of them. But just as the vows were about to be exchanged, a shift in the atmosphere caught everyone off guard. Emily's face, which had been glowing with joy moments ago, suddenly looked tense. Her hands, which had been gently holding James's, tightened, and her jaw clenched. For a brief second, James felt a ripple of unease, but he brushed it aside, thinking it was just the nerves of the big day. He gave her a reassuring smile, but before he knew what was happening, Emily's hand shot out with force, slapping him across the face. The sound of the slap echoed in the church, and for a moment, it felt as though time had stopped. The guests gasped in shock, unable to believe what had just happened. The atmosphere, which had been filled with warmth and excitement, now felt cold and tense. People exchanged uncomfortable glances, unsure of how to react. James stood there, stunned and motionless. His face was red with the sting of the slap, but it was not just physical pain that hurt. It was the hurt of the public humiliation, the confusion, and the sudden shift in the atmosphere. Emily's anger was like a sudden storm, but James didn't understand what had triggered it. They had been planning this day for months, and everything had seemed so perfect. The silence in the room was deafening. Guests sat frozen in their seats, unsure of what to do next. Emily's mother looked horrified, her hands pressed to her mouth, as if she couldn't believe what had just occurred. Emily herself stood frozen for a moment, eyes wide with shock at what she had just done. She hadn't planned for this, and she certainly hadn't expected to react this way. Her emotions were all tangled up inside her, but in front of everyone, her feelings had spilled over in the worst way possible. As James looked at her, the hurt on his face was obvious. His eyes, which had once looked at her with nothing but love and anticipation, now held confusion and disappointment. He hadn't expected this on his wedding day. the day that was supposed to mark the beginning of their new life together. But as he stood there, feeling the sting of Emily's actions, he couldn't shake the feeling that something deeper was going on. He just didn't know what yet. The room remained frozen for a long moment, as if time itself had paused. The guests were still in shock, unsure of how to process what had just happened. The quiet was thick, almost suffocating, as everyone looked between Emily and James. Emily stood there, her hand still raised slightly in the air, as if unsure of what to do next. She had no words, just a sudden rush of regret flooding over her. She blinked several times, as though trying to shake off the reality of the situation, but it wasn't working. James, still holding the sting of the slap on his face, slowly took a deep breath. His heart was racing, but he didn't say a word. He couldn't quite understand what had just happened, but he was still processing it all. It wasn't just the slap. It was the public humiliation, the sudden shift in the mood of the day, and the fact that this was happening on their wedding day, a day that was supposed to mark the beginning of their future together. Emily's eyes widened, and the expression on her face shifted rapidly from anger to confusion, and then to deep regret. She hadn't meant for things to get out of control like this. The slap wasn't planned, nor was the fury that had led to it. But now, standing there in front of everyone, she couldn't take it back. Her breath hitched in her throat, and for a brief moment, she looked at James with a sort of desperation, silently pleading for him to understand. The silence stretched on, and the weight of the moment seemed to hang in the air, making it almost unbearable for the guests. The minister, who had been poised and prepared for the next part of the ceremony, was now unsure of what to do. He glanced nervously between the bride and groom, unsure of how to salvage the situation. He cleared his throat and took a small step forward, his voice calm but tentative. "Perhaps we should take a moment," he suggested gently, trying to break the tension. But Emily barely heard him. She was too focused on James, too caught up in the whirlwind of emotions racing through her. She had never meant to hurt him. It wasn't about him. It was about everything else. Everything she had been holding inside for so long. And now, with everything out in the open, she wasn't sure how to make it right. James's hand slowly moved up to his cheek, where the slap had landed. It wasn't the pain that bothered him most, though. It was the confusion and the sudden feeling of distance that had sprung up between them. He had never expected their wedding day to be a battleground for emotions. They had always been a strong couple, and no matter the challenges they faced, they had always worked through them together. But this was something completely different, something unexpected. For a long time, Emily couldn't find the words to apologize. She just stood there, feeling the weight of the eyes that were all on her, her own eyes welling up with tears. She had messed up. This was supposed to be the happiest day of their lives. But instead, it had turned into something unrecognizable. It wasn't just the slap. It was everything that had led to this moment. The stress, the expectations, the pressure to be perfect, to live up to everyone's expectations. "I'm so sorry," Emily whispered after what felt like an eternity. Her voice was small, almost too quiet for anyone to hear, but James did. He looked at her, and for a brief second, his expression softened. He didn't know what had caused her to act this way, but he could see that she was truly sorry. He could see the regret in her eyes, the shame that had followed the anger. James took a step forward, his eyes never leaving hers. "It's okay," he said quietly, though his voice betrayed a hint of hurt. He wasn't sure how to fix this or even where to start, but for now, he just needed to make her understand that he was willing to hear her out. He wasn't going to walk away from her, not over something like this. But the guests, still reeling from the shock, had begun to whisper among themselves. Emily's parents, who had been so excited about the wedding, now looked concerned. Her mother's face was pale, her hands trembling slightly as she reached for her husband's arm. They had raised Emily to be strong, but this moment was too much, too sudden. It was a break in the perfect picture they had all expected to see today. The minister took another step forward, sensing the tension in the air. "Maybe it's best if we take a short break," he suggested again, his tone firm but understanding. The ceremony had already been derailed, and it seemed the best thing to do was to give the couple a moment to breathe. Emily nodded, wiping away the tears that had started to fall, though she still couldn't fully comprehend what had just happened. She had no idea what was going to come next, but she knew one thing for sure. This was going to be harder to fix than she had ever imagined. As the minister suggested taking a break, the guests started to shift uncomfortably in their seats. The mood in the room had changed dramatically from the joy and excitement of the wedding ceremony to an awkward, uneasy silence. People exchanged whispers, glancing back and forth between Emily and James, unsure of how to proceed. The tension hung heavy in the air, and no one seemed quite sure how to react. Emily felt like the ground beneath her was slipping away. She had always imagined this day as one of the happiest moments of her life, the beginning of a new chapter with the person she loved. Instead, everything had turned upside down. She had no idea why she had reacted the way she did, and it was too late to take back what had just happened. The slap was a blur, but the cold silence that followed was almost unbearable. She could feel every pair of eyes in the room on her, and it made her stomach churn with guilt. James, still standing at the altar, was struggling to process everything. His mind was racing, trying to understand what had gone wrong. He had known that they were going through a lot of stress in the lead-up to the wedding. Planning a wedding wasn't easy for any couple, but the pressure had been especially intense for them, given the challenges they faced as an interracial couple. There had been judgment, misunderstandings, and the weight of societal expectations, but none of that seemed to explain why Emily had acted this way today. His heart ached as he looked at her. He could see the tears beginning to well up in her eyes, and for a moment he wanted to go to her and hold her, but he didn't know how. He was hurt, confused, and overwhelmed by everything that had just unfolded in front of so many people. What could he say to her that would make this better? Emily's mother, seated in the front row, was visibly shaken. She had been so excited about the wedding, about seeing her daughter marry the man she had chosen. She had been looking forward to this day for months, but now it felt like a dream had turned into a nightmare. Her hands were trembling as she wiped her eyes, unsure of how to comfort her daughter or how to make sense of what had just happened. She exchanged a worried look with Emily's father, who sat beside her, his face full of concern. Neither of them knew what to do. They had always hoped for a smooth and joyous day, but this moment seemed to shatter everything they had envisioned. The guests were equally unsure. Some of them whispered amongst themselves, casting uneasy glances at Emily and James. Others tried to pretend nothing had happened, but the awkwardness in the room was palpable. Everyone had witnessed a moment of raw emotion, something so private and intense that it left them all feeling exposed. The excitement of the wedding had quickly been replaced by a sense of discomfort that no one seemed to know how to navigate. Meanwhile, James's mind was still spinning. He wasn't sure if he should be angry, sad, or just completely numb. All he wanted was for this to go away, for the awkward tension to dissipate. But it wasn't going to happen that easily. Emily's sudden outburst had changed everything. He tried to think back to the conversations they had had in the past few weeks. Were there any signs that something like this might happen? He couldn't recall any. Emily had seemed happy, excited about their future. So why had this moment turned into something so painful? Finally, after what felt like an eternity, the minister cleared his throat again, stepping toward the couple. "Perhaps we should give you both some time alone," he suggested, his voice gentle but firm. "It's clear this moment requires some reflection." Emily nodded slowly, unable to speak. She felt like her throat was closing up, like there was no way to fix what had just happened. She glanced at James, but he wasn't looking at her. His gaze was directed elsewhere, his expression hard to read. As the guests began to murmur and shift in their seats, the tension in the room slowly started to ease, but only slightly. Some people began to leave the church, sensing that the ceremony wouldn't continue for a while. Others waited, Unsure if they should leave or stay, Emily remained frozen in place, unable to move or speak. She wasn't sure if she was waiting for James to speak first, or if she just didn't know what to say at all. James finally looked at her, his expression softening. "Let's go talk," he said, his voice calm but full of uncertainty. It wasn't the words he had imagined saying on his wedding day, but it was the only thing that made sense. They needed to talk. Emily's heart pounded in her chest, but she nodded. She had no idea what would happen next, but she knew they couldn't let this moment define their entire relationship. She had to find a way to fix this, to make things right. But deep down, she was terrified that it might be too late. As Emily and James walked away from the altar, the weight of the moment felt like it was pulling them in opposite directions. The sounds of whispers and murmurs from the guests grew fainter as they moved to the quiet corner of the church. The air was thick with tension, but neither of them spoke at first. Emily's heart was pounding in her chest, and her mind was racing. She couldn't understand what had happened. Why had she acted that way? What had made her lash out in front of everyone? James was just as quiet, his emotions churning inside him. He didn't know what to say either, but he felt a deep ache in his chest. He had never imagined their wedding day would go like this. It wasn't supposed to be like this. He had dreamed of this day for so long, and now everything felt uncertain. Emily's legs felt weak as she leaned against the cold stone wall, trying to steady herself. Her head hung low, and her hands trembled. She wanted to say something to James, to apologize, to explain, but the words felt stuck in her throat. She had never been so embarrassed in her life. She couldn't believe what she had just done. James looked at her, his face a mixture of hurt and confusion. It was clear he didn't understand why she had hit him, but he could also see that something deeper was at play. He stepped closer, his voice soft but filled with concern. "Emily, talk to me. What's going on?" His words weren't harsh, but they carried the weight of the question he had been trying to answer ever since the slap. Emily swallowed hard, trying to push past the knot in her throat. She took a deep breath before finally speaking, her voice shaky but honest. "I don't know. I don't know what happened. I'm so sorry, James. I didn't mean it. It just happened so fast." James stayed quiet, giving her the space to continue. He wasn't angry, though there was a part of him that still hurt. He just wanted to understand, to make sense of it all. "I've been feeling so much pressure lately," Emily said, her voice barely above a whisper. "The wedding, the expectations, everything has been building up, and I couldn't handle it. And then when you said that thing, I don't know. I just lost control." James's heart softened as he listened to her. He had known she was stressed, but he had no idea it had been affecting her this much. He had thought they were managing everything together. He hadn't realized how overwhelmed she really was. "I never wanted to hurt you," Emily continued, her eyes filled with regret. "I love you, James. I don't know why I did it. I was angry, but not at you. I don't know why I took it out on you like that. I'm so sorry." James's expression softened, though the hurt still lingered. He could see that Emily was genuinely sorry, but he also knew that this moment had shaken them both. He reached out slowly, placing his hand on hers, his touch gentle but firm. "I know you didn't mean it," he said, his voice steady. "But we need to talk about this, Emily. We can't just pretend like everything's fine. We need to figure this out. We need to understand what's going on." Emily nodded, tears welling up in her eyes. "I know. I don't know how to fix this. I feel like I've ruined everything." James shook his head. "You haven't ruined anything. We're just not in a good place right now. But that doesn't mean we can't get through it. We've faced challenges before, Emily. This is just another one." There was a long pause as Emily absorbed his words. She had always admired James's ability to stay calm, to see things from a different perspective. He was right. They had faced challenges before, and they had made it through because they had always talked things through. But this felt different. It felt like they were on the edge of something they couldn't easily fix. "I don't know if I can forgive myself for this," Emily said softly, her voice filled with pain. "I've let you down. I've let everyone down. How can I go back and pretend like nothing happened?" James took a step closer, his gaze softening. "You don't have to pretend, Emily. You don't have to act like nothing happened. We're going to work through this. It's not going to be easy, but we can do it. But we need to be honest with each other. We need to talk about what's really going on inside." Emily nodded, her chest tight with emotion. "I promise, James, I'll do whatever it takes to make this right." For the first time since the incident, James's lips curved into a small, reassuring smile. "We'll figure it out together," he said, "one step at a time." They stood there for a moment, their hands still clasped together, silently acknowledging the challenge ahead of them. But in that moment, despite the uncertainty, there was also a sense of relief. They were facing this together. The church had grown quiet again, the sound of footsteps echoing in the distance as people slowly filed out of the main hall. The guests had all left, unsure of what to make of the scene they had just witnessed. Some had stayed behind in hushed groups, whispering in corners, but Emily and James barely noticed the world around them. In the stillness of the church, it felt as though time itself had slowed to a crawl, giving them the space they needed to reflect, to try to understand what had happened. Emily and James sat down on one of the pews, their shoulders touching lightly, yet an invisible distance still hung between them. She was still processing everything that had happened, her heart heavy with regret, while he was trying to come to terms with what had just unfolded on what should have been one of the happiest days of their lives. The silence stretched between them, but it wasn't uncomfortable. It was as if they were both waiting, allowing themselves to catch their breath before diving into a conversation neither of them was sure how to begin. Emily could feel the weight of the day on her chest, suffocating her with guilt. She wanted to apologize again, to explain how much she had messed up, but the words felt inadequate. I don't understand what happened," she said after a long pause, her voice quiet but filled with frustration. She glanced at James, her eyes searching his face for some sign of understanding. "I was so upset, but I don't even know why. It wasn't you. It wasn't anything you did." James nodded slowly, his gaze fixed on the floor in front of them. He had been trying to understand what had triggered Emily's outburst, but no clear answer had come to him either. He had always thought that they communicated well, that they understood each other. He hadn't seen the pressure building up inside her, the stress from the wedding and everything that came with it. "I know you didn't mean it," he said gently, his voice steady but laced with an undercurrent of confusion. "But I need to know why. We've been through so much together, Emily. You've never done something like that before. I don't get it." The words were harder for her to hear than she expected. It wasn't that James was angry, but there was a quiet disappointment in his voice that cut deeper than she could have imagined. She hadn't meant to disappoint him, yet here they were. She had been so focused on all the stress and expectations leading up to the wedding, but in doing so, she had neglected what was most important: their connection, their trust in each other. Emily felt a lump form in her throat, and her eyes started to well up again. She blinked quickly, trying to push the tears away. "I've been so stressed, James," she said softly. "Not just about the wedding, but about everything. The planning, the family, the expectations, and I didn't know how to talk about it. I kept telling myself I was fine, that everything would be okay, but I wasn't. And when I saw that look on your face today, I just snapped. I felt like I couldn't breathe. And then I hit you." James turned to look at her then, his expression softening as he listened. He could hear the pain in her voice, the way she had bottled everything up until it became too much to handle. He knew that the wedding had been a huge source of pressure for her, but he hadn't realized how much it was weighing on her. "You should have told me, Emily," he said, his tone gentle but firm. "We've always been able to talk about everything, but you kept it inside. I don't want you to feel like you have to hide things from me. We're supposed to be a team, remember?" Her breath hitched in her throat, and she nodded, ashamed of herself. "I know. I thought I could handle it. I didn't want to worry you or make you think I couldn't do it. But I've been struggling, James, and instead of talking about it, I let it all build up, and it just came out in the worst way." James reached over and gently took her hand in his. The touch was warm, comforting, and it made her feel a little less alone in her feelings. "We all struggle sometimes, Emily, but we can't get through this if we don't talk about it. You don't have to carry everything on your own." Emily looked at him, her heart aching with gratitude and regret. "I'm so sorry, James," she whispered. "I never wanted to hurt you, especially not on our wedding day. You mean everything to me, and I don't know how to make this right." He squeezed her hand gently, offering a small smile. "You've already started by talking to me. We'll get through this, okay? It won't be easy, but we'll figure it out together." For the first time since the incident, Emily felt a glimmer of hope. She had expected James to be angry, to walk away, but he wasn't. He was still here, listening to her, trying to understand. The church was quiet now. The only sounds were the distant voices of guests murmuring as they left the building. The wedding reception had been put on hold, and the excitement that had once filled the air was now replaced with a heavy silence. Emily and James sat together in that small corner, a place where time seemed to stand still as they worked through what had just happened. The moment had been difficult for both of them, but now, as they sat there alone, it seemed as though they had the space to reflect and talk openly. Emily's mind was racing, replaying every moment of the ceremony, every emotion that had built up inside her until it burst. She couldn't help but wonder why it had all come to this. Why had she let everything get to her so much? She had always prided herself on being strong, on handling everything life threw her way. But now, looking at James, she realized that she had been neglecting something far more important, their relationship. She took a deep breath, trying to steady herself. "James, I know I've been distant lately," she began, her voice softer than before. "I've been so caught up in everything. The wedding planning, the stress of trying to make everything perfect. But I should have talked to you. I should have told you what was going on inside my head." James turned to her, his expression full of understanding. "I could see it, Emily. I could tell you were stressed, but I didn't know it was this bad. You're not alone in this, you know. I should have noticed the signs sooner." The weight of his words hit her. She had always tried to shield him from her worries, thinking that he wouldn't understand or that it would add to his own burden. But now she saw that by not sharing, she had created a distance between them. She had been so focused on keeping everything together that she had forgotten to lean on the person who meant the most to her. "I didn't want to burden you with my worries," Emily continued, looking down at their intertwined hands. "I thought I could handle it on my own, but I see now that it's not just about me. It's about us. We're supposed to be a team, right? I should have told you what I was feeling." James nodded, his eyes filled with empathy. "We are a team, Emily, but you don't have to handle everything alone. I want to be there for you, even when things get tough. We both have our struggles, and we have to face them together. That's what marriage is about, being there for each other no matter what." Emily's heart swelled with a mix of gratitude and regret. She had known this all along, but it had taken a painful moment for her to truly understand. She had been so focused on trying to make everyone else happy, trying to meet the expectations placed on her, that she had neglected her own well-being and the health of her relationship with James. "I'm sorry," she said quietly, her voice filled with sincerity. "I've been so wrapped up in everything else that I forgot what really matters. You matter, James, and I don't ever want to make you feel like I don't appreciate you or the support you give me." James smiled softly, squeezing her hand. "I know it, Emily, and I'm not angry. I'm just glad you're talking about it now. We can work through this together, one step at a time. It's not going to be easy, but I'm not going anywhere. The weight on Emily's chest seemed to lift just a little. Hearing him say those words, seeing his calm and steady presence beside her, gave her a sense of comfort she hadn't realized she needed. It wasn't about being perfect. It was about being open, honest, and willing to support each other through the ups and downs. She had made a mistake, but it wasn't too late to make things right. I've been thinking, Emily continued, her voice growing a little stronger now. We need to find a way to communicate better. I can't keep bottling things up. I can't keep pretending like I'm fine when I'm not. It's not healthy for me, and it's not healthy for us. James's eyes softened with affection. I agree. We need to be more open with each other. But it's not just about sharing the good things. It's also about the bad. We need to be able to talk about what's bothering us before it gets to this point. I don't want you to feel like you have to carry everything on your own. Emily nodded, feeling the weight of his words sink in. I promise I'll do better. I'll be more open with you, and I'll stop pretending like I can handle everything by myself. We need each other. They sat in silence for a while, simply enjoying each other's presence. The tension in the room had started to ease, and though there were still so many questions about what had happened, one thing was clear. They were both willing to put in the effort to rebuild and strengthen their bond. This wasn't the wedding day they had imagined, but maybe it was the kind of day that would shape their relationship in ways they hadn't anticipated. The days following the wedding were filled with a mixture of quiet reflection and a deep desire to rebuild what had been shaken. Emily and James both knew that the road ahead would not be easy, but they were determined to make it work. They had faced an unexpected hurdle on their big day. But now, as they began to heal and communicate openly, they both felt a sense of hope. They didn't want this incident to define their relationship. Instead, they wanted to use it as a learning experience. James had always been patient, but he now found himself learning more about Emily than he had realized before. Her quiet strength, which he had admired so much, had also led her to internalize her struggles for too long. She had always tried to handle everything herself, not wanting to burden anyone else with her feelings. But now, seeing her vulnerability and understanding the weight she had carried, James knew that they needed to create a space where they could both feel comfortable sharing their emotions freely. Over the next few weeks, Emily and James worked together to understand what had gone wrong and how they could avoid repeating the same patterns. They spent time talking every day, sometimes for hours, about everything, from the pressures of their lives to the dreams they had for the future. Emily found herself opening up more than she ever had before, sharing things she had kept hidden for so long. It wasn't always easy, but each conversation brought them closer. One afternoon, as they sat together in their living room, Emily brought up something that had been on her mind. I've been thinking about how I've been putting everyone's needs before my own, she said, looking at James with a mixture of guilt and realization. I wanted everything to be perfect for the wedding, for our families, for everyone else. But I forgot about myself in the process. I forgot that I needed to take care of me too. James reached over and took her hand, offering her a reassuring smile. We both get caught up in the pressures of life, but that doesn't mean we should forget what's important, each other, and our well-being. It's okay to put yourself first sometimes. You can't pour from an empty cup. Emily smiled, her eyes filled with gratitude. I'm learning that now. I can't keep trying to be perfect all the time. I need to be okay with not having everything together all the time. And I need to let you in more, to let you help me carry the weight. James nodded, squeezing her hand. We're in this together, Emily. Always. Their conversations became more meaningful, filled with understanding and compassion. They began to make small changes in their daily lives to help reduce stress and create more space for their relationship. They set aside time each week to talk without distractions, just the two of them, where they could share their thoughts, hopes, and even their fears. It wasn't always easy to open up, but both of them felt the difference it made in their connection. One evening, they decided to take a walk through the park, something they hadn't done in a while. The air was crisp, and the setting sun cast a soft golden light over the path. They walked side by side, occasionally laughing at something silly or sharing a thought about the future. The stress of the wedding and everything that had followed seemed like a distant memory now, replaced by a stronger bond between them. As they strolled along the path, Emily looked up at James, her heart full. "Thank you for being patient with me," she said softly. "I know I haven't always made it easy, but I'm so glad you didn't give up on me." James turned to her, his expression tender. "I'm not going anywhere, Emily. We've been through a lot, but that's just part of life. We learn, we grow, and we face things together. I wouldn't want to go through this with anyone else." They walked in silence for a while, the sound of their footsteps on the gravel path filling the space between them. It was a peaceful silence, one that spoke of comfort, trust, and a growing sense of security. They didn't have all the answers, and they didn't have a perfect marriage. But they had each other, and that was enough. Later that evening, as they sat on the couch together, James pulled out a small notebook from the drawer. "I thought we could start a new tradition," he said, grinning at her. "Every month, let's write down one thing we're grateful for about each other." Emily's eyes brightened at the idea. "That sounds like a wonderful idea. A reminder to focus on the good things, even when life gets hard." They took turns writing in the notebook, each sharing a meaningful reflection about the other. It became a cherished tradition, one that reminded them daily of the love and respect they had for each other, even when things weren't perfect. As the weeks turned into months, Emily and James found themselves in a much better place. What had started as a painful moment during their wedding had slowly transformed into a turning point in their relationship. They had learned so much about each other, about communication, and about themselves. The challenges they faced together had only strengthened their bond, and they were more united than ever before. One afternoon, as they sat on their porch enjoying the warm sunshine, Emily looked at James with a soft smile. "Do you remember that day?" she asked, her voice gentle. James looked up from his book and met her gaze. "How could I forget? It's the day everything changed." Emily nodded, reflecting on how far they had come since that moment. "At the time, I felt like everything was falling apart. I didn't know how we'd get through it. But now, I see it as a blessing in disguise." James chuckled softly. "I agree. It wasn't easy, but it was real. We didn't hide from it. We worked through it together." The words hung in the air, and Emily couldn't help but feel a deep sense of gratitude for how far they had come. They had both made mistakes, but they had learned from them. And more importantly, they had supported each other every step of the way. It hadn't always been easy, but every difficult conversation, every tear shed, had brought them closer. There were moments when the stress of life still crept in, but they had learned to face it head-on. They had learned to communicate more openly and honestly, to share their fears and frustrations instead of keeping them bottled up. And every time they did, they felt like they were building a stronger foundation for their future together. One evening, they sat down at their kitchen table, a glass of wine in hand, and began discussing their plans for the future. They talked about travel, about their dreams, and about the life they wanted to build. The future didn't seem so uncertain anymore. They had learned how to be a team, how to support one another, and how to handle whatever came their way. Emily realized that the real change had come from within. She had learned that it was okay to be vulnerable, to ask for help, and to lean on someone when things got tough. She had spent so many years thinking she had to do everything on her own, but now she understood that sharing her burdens with James didn't make her weak. It made them stronger as a couple. "James," she said quietly, her voice filled with emotion, "I'm so grateful for you. You've taught me so much, and I don't think I ever fully appreciated how lucky I am to have you by my side." James smiled and reached across the table, taking her hand in his. "You've taught me a lot too, Emily. About patience, about love, and about never giving up on each other. I'm just as grateful for you." They sat in a comfortable silence, simply enjoying each other's presence. There was no rush, no pressure. They were both content in the moment, knowing that they had each other to face whatever life would throw their way. It wasn't always going to be easy, but they were no longer afraid of the challenges ahead. That night, as they lay in bed together, Emily thought back to the day of their wedding, the day that had started with so much hope and excitement, but had turned into something far more complex. At the time, she had been terrified that the incident would tear them apart. But now, with the benefit of hindsight, she saw it differently. It had been a wake-up call, a reminder that no relationship was perfect, and that's okay. What mattered was how they responded to the difficult moments. They had chosen to face them together, to work through the pain, and to come out stronger. James pulled her closer, his arms wrapping around her. "We've come a long way," he whispered, his voice calm and reassuring. "And we'll keep going, together." Emily smiled, feeling a sense of peace settle over her. She had never imagined that something so difficult could bring them closer, but now she knew it was true. It was the challenges, the moments of struggle that had allowed them to grow as individuals, and as a couple. They had learned to be there for each other, to communicate honestly, and to support each other through the tough times. As the night grew quiet, and the world outside faded into the background, Emily closed her eyes, feeling a deep sense of contentment. She didn't have all the answers, and life wasn't perfect, but she knew one thing for sure. She had found a partner who was willing to walk with her through the ups and downs, and that was enough.